up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Hidden Forces with me, Demetri Kofinas. Today, I speak with Tim O'Reilly, a figure who has played a seminal role in creating the framework through which an entire generation has come to know and understand the modern internet. If you've ever used terms like open source or Web 2.0, you're likely unknowingly relying on the language cultivated through Tim's innumerable conferences, gatherings, and intimate conversations that have reshaped the computer industry over the last 25 years. He is the founder, CEO, and chairman of O'Reilly Media, and his most recent book, WTF, What's the Future and Why It's Up to Us, will form the basis for much of today's conversation. In this episode, we look to cultivate the skill of map making, an essential requirement of any good explorer, as we indulge one of the most innate biological catalysts for human progress, the need to explore. We learn to think differently, to envision the future, and to differentiate between the world as we perceive it and that of the infinite, unknowable realm of the real. We posit theories like symbiogenesis and Korzybski's injunction that provide a framework for understanding how we understand and where we, as organic life forms, fit into this evolving network of increasingly intelligent machines. As always, you can join our email list by visiting the show's website at hiddenforcespod.com. If you listen to Hidden Forces on your iPhone or Android, make sure to subscribe. If you like the show, write us a review. And if you want a sneak peek into how each episode is made, or for special storylines told through pictures and questions, then like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod. And now, let's get right to this week's conversation. Tim, welcome to Hidden Forces.
I'm glad to be with you.
As I was saying to you, you are the first guest whose theoretical framework for thinking about the world is not just so close to my own, but also is actually the expressed framework for how we talk about this show on a regular basis to the audience. So at the outset, I want to tell listeners that what Hidden Forces is, the way we approach our shows and the way we approach talking about reality, is very much in line with what Tim has been doing for decades. So why don't you, before I kind of get into all the questions I have for you, Tim, why don't you give our audience a little bit of a background into who you are?
Well, professionally, my company for the last 35, 40 years, I guess you'd say we've been providing the picks and shovels of knowledge to the internet revolution. We started out publishing computer books. More than one internet billionaire told me that they built their company with the help of an O'Reilly programming book. And then we launched into conferences. We do, our latest conferences are on things like big data and AI. But we also have an online learning platform called Safari, which is really the heart of our business. It's ebooks, video, and live online training. And it's really how we teach people what's happening at the edges. Our fundamental business model, we realized long ago, was not books or conferences or even online publishing. It's really technology transfer from the leading edge of technology to people who want to follow. And as a result of that, we've spent a lot of time thinking about how do you understand what matters, what's going to matter in the future. And the other thing that I've done a lot with over the years is a kind of technology activism, trying to, as Edwin Schlossberg once said, the skill of writing is to create a context in which other people can think. And so I've effectively tried to draw maps of the world the way I saw it in such a way that they would help other people to see and think about what was coming.
Well, you're touching on semantics also in language, and I want to get into that too.
Yeah.
And George Simon, who introduced you to that work. I have many quotes here of yours and others that you've quoted, and I'm going to recite a number of those during our conversation. And I want to start with one that will lead me into a question. Now I'm quoting you. I didn't predict the future. I drew a map of the present that identified the forces shaping the technology and business landscape. Now, you've called yourself a map maker. You kind of alluded to it there as well. I want to ask you about that process, how you do that. But also, I wonder, when you look around the world, do you think that how much does your map or do your maps differ from those of your compatriots? And do you feel that our maps are more divergent today than they have been in living memory?
No, not really. To your last question, I think the world that we live in is a collaborative exercise in map making, where we effectively are inventing reality for each other with our descriptions of it. And, if you think about the fundamental entrepreneurial act, it is, in fact, to see the world in a new way and then to persuade other people that you are right. And the process of entrepreneurial discovery, it's often, you see multiple people who are getting little pieces of it. So for example, you look at the origins of Google's pay-per-click advertising. They didn't invent it. It was actually, a spin out of Bill Gross's Idea Labs. It became a company called Overture, which Yahoo bought. But Overture sold the pay-per-click ads to the highest bidder. And Google's genius was to say, actually, we can redesign the marketplace with the additional information signal that we have. And so that we actually discovered that you get more money if you sell to some combination of the highest bidder and the ad that is most likely to be clicked on. So they actually had a better map of what the knowledge, the data was able to teach us about what was going on. And as a result, they built this phenomenal business. Now, of course, they also had a better map for actually how to do search. But in some sense, that's an example of how a deeper insight into what's actually happening in the world leads to new possibilities. The same thing happened with the rise of ride-hailing as we know it now. There was the original idea, for example, of Uber was text message to black car drivers. The original idea of Sunil Paul's sidecar was, summon a car driven by an ordinary person. Lyft picked up on that. Uber didn't pick that up till several years later. But all these streams come together as people have new ideas about the way that the world could work. But I think it's also very true just in our thinking about the world. And one of the things that I think that I've tried to do in my career is rooted really in the ideas of general semantics, which was Alfred Korzybski back in the 20s and 30s, was really talking about this idea, as were many other people. You think about Magritte, this is not a pipe.
I'm not familiar with that.
It's a famous painting of Magritte's. It's basically a briar pipe, I think it is, sitting in the middle of a field of clouds. And the title in French is "This is not a pipe," because it's a picture of a pipe.
Okay,
And it was that sense of the difference between the representation and the reality. And of course, that was Korzybski's famous statement, the map is not the territory. And we can hear that, but fail to understand it. Because there are so many assumptions we make all of the time about the way the world works that we're blind to. We just think that is reality, as opposed to that it's a layer imposed on reality.
So his injunction combines the limitations of our nervous system, our sensory perception.
That's right.
Combined with the limitations presented by language, the way that our brain processes that information and simulates it. Are you familiar, probably are, with Kant's philosophy on mathematics and the way that arithmetic structures time and geometry structures space?
Yeah.
Is that something similar in your view? In other words, how divergent do you think the reality, if there is such a thing, and I'm curious what you think that might be, or if such a thing exists, or if it's even possible to express it, or if it's even relevant, how divergent it is with what we experience as the common experience, this sort of objective, this communal reality?
At the furthest extremes of this kind of thinking, you can imagine that the reality that we all share is completely different from something that others would imagine. But you don't have to go out to the furthest extremes of consciousness to understand that we live in a very different world than a dog does. Their sensorium brings in this incredible world of smell. They can hear on different frequencies. They see differently. I'm just reading a wonderful book right now called The Peregrine, which is basically about peregrine, falcons and just how they see. And, you think about just throughout the animal kingdom, the diversity of actual experience. So that was Korzybski's point. There's this infinite thing out there, and we take in a small part of it through our sensorium.
A microcosm of the information that the universe creates, we have access to.
That's right. We get it in through our sensorium. And, of course, we as human beings, one of our amazing powers has been to increase our sensorium. We can see into the infrared.
Exactly.
We can hear ultrasound. We can see X-rays. There's all these things that we've done. We now have this location sense with GPS. We're augmenting our ability to take in more of the signal and make sense of it. But we still have to understand that there's a process of abstraction. And the second layer that Korzybski really talked about was this idea that beyond even our experience of the world, there's a layer of the stories we tell ourselves about it. And the stories actually shape what we are able to see. And, I find that, you can demonstrate that to people very, very easily with, obviously optical illusions, but even just conceptual, reframings. And a lot of what I try to do in the book is to tell the story of how I saw different things about the world than some of my compatriots simply by, in some sense, comparing, just, try to get out of the stories that were being told, looking at the world fresh and saying, what didn't make it into the story? What didn't make it into the narrative? And then trying to construct a new narrative.
I am curious how you do that. I want to point out a few things while you're talking, or add them, or flesh out. Further to your point, there are theories that the ancient Greeks, for example, could not see the color blue because they didn't have the word for it. Homer called the Mediterranean the wine dark sea. The same is true for Eskimos with snow. You had an experience, as I understand, where you were able to see different types of grass based on the same idea. So the framework we have, similar theories were put forward. Again, I don't know if there's any evidence for it, but that the Native Americans in the Caribbean couldn't see Columbus's ships because they had no framework for imagining such a thing. There's another quote of yours. You're actually quoting Tom Stoppard, but I want to mention it because you touched on this idea of sort of something becoming reality that manifests. And I love it for many reasons, this quote. I'll read it and I'll give you my reasons, but I think it's something the audience needs to hear. A man breaking his journey between one place and another at a third place of no name, character, population, or significance sees a unicorn cross his path and disappear. My God, says a second man, I must be dreaming. I thought I saw a unicorn. At which point a dimension is added that makes the experience as alarming as it will ever be. A third witness, you understand, adds no further dimension, but only spreads it thinner, and a fourth still thinner. And the more witnesses there are, the thinner it gets, and the more reasonable it becomes, until it is as thin as reality, the name we give to the common experience. So that speaks to me on so many levels.
Yeah,
Number
a
one,
lovely quote. Stoppard is so brilliant.
It's beautiful, and thank you for putting that in your book. One, of course, is it captures really the unique process of creating something from nothing, which is the entrepreneurial experience. It is an idea ultimately starts in one mind, and it spreads from there. And it's something about, obviously, there are things that we ingest when we have a certain vision, but when I think of sort of these great visionaries, the process of manifesting something into reality is not about physically turning it into real. It's about convincing everyone else that it's real, because it takes a team, a village, a country to make something, to manifest something.
Well, it's also about understanding the way that all of the parts fit together, because often you're able to imagine something different, but the world isn't ready for it. A really good example, coming back to ride-hailing, was that Sunil Paul in 2000 wrote a patent for all the ways that you could use GPS to have on-demand transportation. But smartphones weren't really there. GPS wasn't really there. He didn't understand any of the pieces that came together to become the final ride-hailing. In fact, he ended up being third to the market when he came back at it after Uber and Lyft were sort of slowly putting the pieces together. And so it's often the case that ideas accrete in some sense. And so there is a level where I use the image in the book of doing a picture puzzle, but all the pieces aren't on the table. And then somebody delivers another pile of pieces, and you can suddenly see the pattern. And that pattern recognition, it might be one person at first, and then more and more people come to agree with it. And the point of the Stoppard quote is that often those things are remarkable, and then they become everyday. And in fact, they even become unremarkable. One of the things that I still think of in my experience, because it was one of those moments of astonishment, was when we created the first commercial website, we're demonstrating the web to people.
This is your pop-up shop at the mall or somewhere?
Yeah, well, no. This was actually at a trade show. We were actually showing GNN, which was was a precursor to Yahoo, 1993. And people they did, never mind Columbus, that's speculative. I can tell you, people, first of all, they were shocked. They had, you showed them and you'd say, hey, that picture just came from the University of Hawaii. And they would be like, no, I don't buy it. It's like, because they could.
They thought it physically had to travel.
Well, they sort of understood that you could have it on a CD-ROM in your computer. That it was hypertext, but that it would come over the internet. They also didn't understand, for example, the concept of a browser.
Right.
Because it was sort of like, it was an integrated software application. When you had, say, Microsoft Cinemania, their hypertext, movie encyclopedia, or Microsoft Encarta, it was this integrated application with everything. And they were like, no, here's this application, and it's just a frame, and there's nothing in it. And it gets these documents from somewhere else. And that's so commonplace to us today. And yet I can report to you that back in 1993, people were astonished, and they were trying to wrap their heads around what seems to us like a totally obvious idea now.
Mm-hmm. Because they didn't have a framework for understanding what it was.
That's right.
What did that feel like to be present during that time? Is it comparable in any way to any time since?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you have that all the time.
But the internet was so transformational that, just from my perspective, I think of, let's say, mobile, but I still think that the internet, from my experience of the internet, and I was a child, was far more transformational than mobile.
Oh, I don't know. When people started, first zooming and pinching on multi-touch displays, the first multi-touch displays were actually big. There was this guy, Jeff Hahn, who was demonstrating one at our eTech conference and at TED. And people were astonished that you could drag, and of course, there'd been earlier ones that we'd seen that were mechanical that Danny Hillis had built for Disney and for the military. But, this idea that you could actually interact with your hands and this, people were astonished by it. And now, of course, it's just obvious. And, that beginning of those touch screens, it was like then you started taking it so for granted that a new device would come out and you'd start stroking the screen and nothing would happen, and it felt inert and dead because it was this object from a previous era, and you expected it to work in the new way. Mm-hmm. And I think those kinds of experiences are around us all the time. And so I look for, like when I'm looking for things that are interesting, I look for those WTF moments.
Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit, because that's really about the building process, the updating of the maps, the building of of new maps. What is your process? How do you do that? Because that is really the key, right, to being able to catch major changes in society.
Well, I think what I try to do, first off, as I said, is to have some convictions about long-term trends that I believe in. And, I think of these as vectors. I think you call them forces.
Right.
And these are often just ideas that I pick up somewhere and they stick. I remember one that stuck in my head many, many years ago. I heard a talk, and there was some VP at IBM who said, well, people all talk about Moore's Law, but what they don't realize is that storage is getting cheaper even faster than computing is getting faster. And I thought, oh, yeah, storage densities are going to double. And then, when I have one of those sort of vectors in mind, of course, a vector being both a direction and a quantity, this is getting, faster, this is getting smaller, you start noticing things that seem to give evidence of it, And so, there was Gordon Bell with his My Life Bits project, and, he was a guy at Microsoft Research, and he was saying, we're going to be able to have a camera that will record our entire life. He couldn't do it yet, but he was sort of, and I go, oh, data point, and of course, if you have 2 data points, that's a line, and then you start seeing, the rise of big data, and wow, Google is actually crawling the entire internet, and they're storing it. Wow, that's another point about big data, and before long you have a whole storyline. And it's just so you kind of get this idea of a vector. And then when you get new points along that vector, eventually they start to coalesce into, hey, that line's getting thicker and thicker. And sometimes they don't go as fast as you think. Like I've been looking at, synthetic biology for a long time. And one of the things that, is a really important sort of data point along a vector for me is sort of bottom-up uptake. because there's a lot of technologies that get announced with great fanfare by big companies. And I'm going, where are the hackers who are playing with it? It was really summed up really beautifully once for me. I was at a developer meeting for a big company, big enterprise software company, and one of the guys who ran developer relations at Google and I were in as speakers to this group. And he summed it up beautifully. He said, I have only one question for you. Do any of your developers go home and play with this stuff on their own time, at the end of the workday?
That's a really good question.
And they sort of shamefacedly said, no, And he said, well, there's your answer. Until that's happening, you don't really have anything. And, I've always been a big believer. In fact, the subtitle of Make Magazine, which my colleague Dale Doherty created at O'Reilly Media, it's now a separate company, Maker Media, was technology on your own time. And that, so take an area like synthetic biology, where it really got my attention was when there were things like the iGEM competition, actually genetically engineered machines competition with, high school students. But it hasn't, it didn't go quite as quickly as I expected. But I'm still, you still watch it. And then, along comes CRISPR and you go, wow, there was sort of, sometimes all the pieces don't arrive in this sort of steady progression a la Moore's Law. There's this breakthrough. And that's something I'm thinking a lot about blockchain right now, for example. There's been, if you look at, the early internet, for example, it started in 1969. A lot of the early applications were these, command line utilities. And, so it was like 20 years before we got the World Wide Web, and bam, it exploded. And so, a lot of people are really hyping blockchain, but it looks to me more like the early internet than it looks like the web, which is when it really took off and become something. And I think, synthetic biology was like that until CRISPR came along.
That's great that you brought up blockchain. Do you think that perhaps we need a different, or it's going to be a different distributed ledger technology that doesn't run on a blockchain, that doesn't have the limitations of blockchain at scale, that's going to be able to fulfill the promise of distributed consensus for the data layer?
I think it's certainly a plausible hypothesis. And again, you've got to think, you have a hypothesis, you kind of just lay it to one side in your mind, and then data either walks in and fits itself neatly into the hypothesis and kind of strengthens it or challenges it. And so, I look, again, another analogy, and again, history is a great way of preparing, reading history, thinking about it, is a great way of preparing your mind to be flexible in your beliefs and the scenarios you see. So a good analogy that I see is hypertext, because Ted Nelson had this idea of hypertext with Xanadu. There was also the Plato system, and they were beautiful, but they didn't actually end up scaling. And the thing that Tim Berners-Lee did that was different, that made it scale, was he violated something that they believed was fundamental to hypertext. That was two-way links, that they had to be recognized by both sides. And Tim's invention, the core of it, was in some ways the 404, the error message that you got if a link didn't resolve. It turns out there was this funny little thing that the purists would have said, oh, that's a bug, but turned out to be the key to a system that actually worked and scaled. And so I think we may be, be waiting for our 404 moment with blockchain, where somebody just does something a little bit differently, and then all of a sudden, bang, everybody goes, oh, that was the slightly different twist in how to think about it that made new things possible.
So how do you keep, we had John Borthwick, who you've mentioned in your book, on this show, and he actually was the first person to recommend your book to me. I didn't even know it was coming out. Well, I forget how long it was that I had him on. He talks about how at BetaWorks, they make a point to be as close to the technology as possible so that they're not, again, living off the map or just, viewing the map and mistaking it for the territory. How do you go about that process? Let's say specifically in blockchain, what do you do to keep yourself close enough to the action so that you might be able to catch that innovative technology? Yeah,
I actually have kind of an opposite approach. In some ways, I like to say I watch technology from the cheap seats, where you think about, down close, you think at courtside at a basketball game or whatever, you can see everything up close. But if you're up, in the stands,
you can actually
see the patterns. And I always thought that one of my advantages was that I was not actually in Silicon Valley. Most of my career, I built my company. I was a 2 hours from Silicon Valley, up in the little apple orchard town, Sebastopol. And so in a lot of ways, I just look for interesting people.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, I often look for interesting people that are at the conjunction of several different trend lines.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that I have a rigorous methodology.
That's interesting.
For me, part of it is I'm a little bit of, I'm an enthusiast. I just like certain things.
You just go with your instinct. If you like something, if something draws your attention, you follow it.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
Yeah, and
I feel the same way.
Yeah, and it reminds me. I tell a story in the book of Richard Feynman and how he got into quantum electrodynamics. He was burned out on his work. And he decided, screw it, I'm not going to do any physics. And then he's in the cafeteria and watches somebody spinning a plate, and he notices there's a difference in the rate of spin, and he just starts idly calculating. He can see the little logo on the plate, and it's going around a different rate than the edge of the plate, whatever. And he starts calculating just for fun, being a total geek. And then it's like this eureka moment where he goes, oh, wait, and he starts understanding that this is actually the answer he'd been looking to. For this problem that he was finding deadly and boring. He got it in play. And it's one reason that I think I've always been drawn to technology movements that are really outside of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, and came to this conclusion.
Outside of the entrepreneurial ecosystem?
Yeah, Silicon Valley tends to follow and invest in technologies when there's money to be made, right? And
$1 billion company.
Yeah, but not even that. But you're already at several removes on the map by the time you get to that point. Versus, again, and some of this came from looking at things like the World Wide Web. When we were first looking at it, nobody thought you could make any money there. Open source software, nobody thought it was about money, and that came later. And so I think that the maker movement, nobody thought, oh yeah, this is where we're going to make our fortune. And I think I guess as a society, and particularly in the tech industry, we are so obsessed with the entrepreneurial narrative. And I actually think that far more innovation, first of all, if I think about the map of Silicon Valley, here are some things that are fundamentally wrong with it. One,
the map that is used.
By the VCs, by the entrepreneurs. One is this idea that it begins when VCs fund entrepreneurs, and that entrepreneurs are out there. They literally think their job begins with getting funding. And there's some great stories. My partner, Bryce Roberts at OETV, has this thing called Indie VC, and he's always sharing these great stories.
What is this? It's an online magazine?
No. Indie VC is basically our approach to venture capital that focuses on cash flow positive industries.
Okay.
Like O'Reilly Media, I started with $500. I didn't get any VC ever. It's now a couple $100 million company.
Probably saved you a lot of stress too.
Yeah. Well, no, there's often a lot of stress, but it's a very different kind of company. And there's a great story that Bryce shared, which was of two brothers who, I forget the name of the company, but they started a company to make some kind of protein bars. And they wrote this business plan, and they were like, one of them told his dad, who was an immigrant, right? He said, we have this plan, we're going to go out and get venture capital. And the dad said, no, you're not. You're going to go out and you're going to sell 1,000 bars. And they went out and sold 1,000 bars, and they went, oh, holy shit, we can do this.
So interesting.
And they didn't actually need to raise money. They just needed to get customers.
Right.
So there's like just this one area. There's a whole set of really interesting businesses that are not hyperscale, that are cash flow positive because you actually find customers who want what you, and that's what I did. And so that's one. But another one is really this, notion that the only companies that matter have really big exits. And that you're always searching for the pot of gold. Another thing that's kind of an assumption is, this swarming behavior where people they're not really sitting there trying to solve problems. The problem they're trying to solve is, how do I get funded and how do I get to an exit? Does this sound like it might be?
That's very frightening. And whenever I hear that, and that isn't, in many ways, that is a phenomenon we see with these ICOs, with many of these ICOs where I was actually at this event where someone told me he was gonna do an ICO, and I asked him about his white paper. He said, well, that's why I'm doing the ICO. I just thought that was the classic, so most absurd thing in the world. This wasn't a very highbrow, gathering. It was a sort of public gathering here in New York with hundreds of people. But I mean, that's the kind of the classic thing.
Well, and you'll go to conferences for entrepreneurs, and you'll meet some young entrepreneur who says, I want to be an entrepreneur, and I'm trying to get funding. And I'm kind of going,
That's
no,
so weird.
It's just backwards. No, I'm trying to be an entrepreneur. So I've got this business. I'm starting this business. I'm finding people who want what I'm doing. And now I need some extra rocket fuel. One of Bryce's lines is, VCs are rocket fuel. You only want a VC if you're trying to build a rocket, And there's a lot of businesses that are not rockets. But anyway, we digress.
Well, let me ask you, are you familiar with, this is an alternative DLT, it's a consensus algorithm called Hashgraph. Are you familiar with them at all?
No.
We've covered them on this show. And it's interesting, that kind of segues into this question of open source. This is a patented protocol for distributed consensus, but it's also very promising. And since you're not familiar with it, I'm happy to send you some stuff afterwards.
Sure.
But it would be a good segue to talk about this thing of open source, which is something I did want to talk to you about. Because, first of all, why don't you give our audience a primer on your background in free software, open source?
I think that's old news. We
Old
don't need
news.
to.
All right,
It's 20 years old. I don't think we really need to go there. What I would just say about open source is really the thing that I think is a missing ingredient from a lot of innovation is that you need a lot of opportunity to have a lot of innovation. And actually, you mentioned Borthwick earlier. He had this great comment years ago, which I quote in the book, where this was after Twitter shut down their developer ecosystem.
Right.
And he said, this is a really bad idea. It doesn't make sense to shut down your developer ecosystem before someone else figures out your business model for you. And a little cynical, but, you think about where platforms and where companies go wrong is when they try to take too much of the opportunity. And it's sort of a central theme through my career and my book is this idea that a really good economy and a really good company is value creating for everyone. And it creates more value for other people than it gets for itself. So there's a net surplus. And when you start taking too much, and you think about companies that are, they're clearly on a death spiral because they're basically eating their ecosystem.
What you're kind of talking about is something like, let's say, the extremes are like, let's say, a Wikipedia, which creates a tremendous amount of value for the community, but doesn't really capture any of that value for itself.
Yeah.
Versus, let's say, the securitization market during the height of the mortgage refinancing boom on Wall Street, which is extractionary.
Yeah.
And it's how do you find that right mixture where you're creating enough profits. So what's an example of a company you think does that really well?
Well, I think on balance, Google is still a very good example of a company that's a net value creator, although I think on some critical measures they're going down. But you think about, for example, what they did with Android. And that was a really useful strategic use of open source software, for example, where they understood that if Apple came to dominate the smartphone market with a vertically integrated platform, the world of the web was going away, and they had to preserve it. And they did it by giving away a lot of value to other people. And I think, and of course we're seeing other things they're doing like with TensorFlow and sort of opening up AI.
Well, what do you think of Apple's approach? I mean, not to kind of sideswipe you there with that, but what do you think of Apple's approach? Because I think that's an interesting example where they could be criticized for being so controlling with their hardware and their software and creating like this ecosystem, but at the same time, they made technology available for use in ways that perhaps it wouldn't have been otherwise.
Absolutely. There's this great saying that used to be at the heart of the Perl programming community, which was, there's more than one way to do it. And I think
simple.
There's a fundamental, error that a lot of people make looking for the one true way. We see this throughout society, throughout technology. The point is, there are lots of different ways to be successful and different business models. And a lot of what I actually talk a little bit in the book about business model mapping. How do you actually understand? And I'm probably going to do a lot more with that. How do you understand a particular company's business model in such a way that you understand how all the pieces work together. So one of the things, for example, if you look at Google versus Facebook, both ad supported, but very different business model. Google depends on there being lots of content outside of Google that they search, right? Facebook is trying to get all the content on Facebook. Fundamental difference. Google basically succeeds when people use its services and then they go away because they found exactly what they wanted. Facebook succeeds when people
more clicks, more engagement, more
and teasing apart those things and understanding how they play together, I think, is a really important job for any entrepreneur and for us as a society as we think through how do the pieces of our society work together, and when we make certain changes, are they producing the result that we expected?
So that's kind of where I was going, not that last part when we were talking about Apple, that's kind of where I was going with open source, which was essentially to extract from you an answer as to whether or not it is universally good to have that type of a model. And it sounds like your answer is that it's really about what is the goal, what do we want to achieve?
Exactly.
That's great.
Yeah, I actually wrote a piece once, many years ago, about Bill Gates. It was for Nature, of all places. A short piece, it was called Information Wants to be Valuable, which was, of course, the second part of Stuart Brand's famous dictum about information wants to be free, but it also wants to be valuable. And, I just said, look, Bill Gates and Larry Wall, creator of Perl, any of the open source software people, have different strategies for creating value from the thing that they made. And, Bill Gates was an entrepreneur. He was, somebody who understood how to build, enormous value, by keeping tight control over what he did and leveraging that control. And Larry's this, idealistic guy who was building cool software, and he'd gotten a lot of cool software for free himself. And he said, I want to maximize the value of what I created by giving it away. And they both, again, you look at all those open source pioneers of the internet and of Linux and so on, they created enormous value. They just made a different choice. And if they had made the choice to try to commercialize it, they would not have succeeded because they weren't the right kind of people. They didn't have access to the right kinds of resources. And Tim Berners-Lee was not Bill Gates, but his strategy actually beat Bill Gates' strategy. And if you think about it, it's like it's just other people made the money from it, but the web actually took over from Microsoft's vision of the Microsoft network, or Steve Case's vision of AOL, which were the entrepreneurial version, and this free version just had better scaling characteristics.
And it changed, and you were touching on the way that our relationship to software transformed from being this artifact to being something that is now living on the clouds, living somewhere else. I like what you had to say about open source there, because I do see that as a big challenge in the governance structure for what's happening in the blockchain community. I think that presents a problem, and I don't know how that gets fixed, but it's clearly something that we see. You mentioned Facebook, and we're talking about sort of what the goal is, what's the intention. How far do you think the Facebook product, this is also relevant in the context of the announcement that they're changing their newsfeed. Now, we don't know exactly how that's going to look. The changes haven't been implemented yet. But how far do you think Facebook has strayed from what the intention was, and what do you think can be done? And are there certain limitations on what Facebook can achieve given the ad model in combating the stuff that, everyone talks about, fake news and everything else?
I think that story is being written. And I actually have a fair degree of confidence that the ad model can be fixed. The question, of course, is, Facebook has been so phenomenally successful that something that if they hadn't gone down the path where media had this feeding frenzy, around social media, and they were making 60% of what they're making today, everybody would have been super happy with the company, right? But if their revenues went down by 30 or 40% as a result of the changes, everybody would be, oh my God, this would be a terrible failure.
Which kind of speaks to your point, sorry to interrupt, about you're not taking VC capital.
That's right. And also just in some sense understanding just how much we are in the grip of this model where most of the wealth today is created in financial markets, not in the exchange of real goods and services by people. And I'm doing a lot of research on this, trying to actually quantify this effect. You know, if you think about a company like Google, they've actually reasonably well equalized the amount of money they've made as a company, i.e., we're selling you services and you're giving us money, and you kind of add that up over time, and then you look at their market cap, and you kind of go, oh, okay, you know, this bet on the future, their future earnings is sort of equalizing, whereas Amazon is not anywhere near there yet. You know, I mean, you know, they're worth hundreds of times what their actual earnings of, you know, in the exchange of goods and services. And so,
does that how much does that take into account the reinvestment?
Well, I mean, sure, there is huge reinvestment in the growth, and that's fair, but you know, it's still money that's not available to the shareholders. And back to this idea of maps, Jeff has managed to sell a profoundly different vision of what it means to be a public company than, say, Walmart, where you know you kind of go, I have this predictable stream of earnings, and I'm going to buy a share of that stream of earnings, and you know, and you have this regular multiple. But you also have this set of assumptions about, you know, there's this great quote from Garrison Keillor, who I know is out of favor for good reasons these days, but I still said something really wonderful once. It's something like, one day you will realize that good luck is having something you would have wanted if you didn't have it, if you didn't already have it.
I hadn't heard that before.
And it's just a wonderful one of those, you know, I love quotes like that they just give you a way of seeing the world. And I think about that a lot because I think, wow, you know, take Walmart. They make $25 billion a year in profits. You know, if Walmart gave their workers another $5 billion a year, you know, in the form of higher wages, and so they only made $20 billion in profits. And, you know, let's say, you know, I were Sam Walton and I was the owner of that. Would I really miss the extra $5 billion? You know, and yet what is it about the structure of our shareholder capitalism that says, oh my gosh, you can't do that because we, the shareholders, get all of that. You know,
it's that quote you've used. That you've often cited Milton Friedman's quote about the goal of enterprise should be to maximize profits for shareholders.
Yeah, and I think that's a really bad map.
Which I think is changing a bit.
It is a bit, but I think we're a long way from that. You know, like if you compare, you know, how Mark Zuckerberg is dealing with fake news and trying to come to grips with it, and how, in general, companies, even the most idealistic companies, are actually, you know, dealing with the financialization of the economy. I don't see we're making all that much progress.
The financial markets, the issue of divergent values in the derivative layer of society from the underlying real economy is so enormous and so impactful. I mean, we're living in the aftermath of the crisis of 2008 that we still haven't fully escaped as a result of much of the private debt that the financial sector created in order to sort of create this hydroponic environment that they could then reap. And it's really unclear. I mean, that's a huge issue, and it's really unclear how to resolve that because of the layers of regulations that benefit the largest banks and the largest financial institutions.
Yeah. Just to be clear, when we talk about the financialization of the economy, it's not really the banks that are the focus of that. I mean, the banks are certainly part of it. It's really shareholder capitalism, the idea that you get money in the betting market, effectively. You know, can you get people to bet on your startup, if you want to bring it back to the startup economy, as opposed to, you know, what do you actually get from delivering a service to someone?
So you're talking about the mechanism by which capital finds its way to an enterprise, which is through bidding up the stock price.
Well, no, but here's the point. The capital is no longer finding its way to the enterprise. I mean, when people are buying Apple stock, Apple already has all the capital they need. They don't need capital. There's no capital finding its way to Apple. The capital is simply a big pool of money that's sloshing around in bets on people who don't need it.
You're saying that the financial markets have become a mechanism through which third parties can extract wealth from each other and separate entirely from the underlying
mechanism of real investment in things that people need. You know, in some sense, if you have a big poker game and you add these people a high stakes poker game, and you're pretty clear it's gambling. And you kind of go, that's not the same as making things that people need, buying things from each other in a real economy. It's a poker game. And you go, yet our financial markets, it's a poker game, and we call it investment.
I agree with that. Do you think, though, the problem is that there isn't enough capital getting to where it needs to go, or that the structure of the financial system itself is such that it is creating this massive divergence of wealth, and so that is deprioritizing, it's making certain business models non-viable?
That's right. And it's really creating a situation where we have a non-optimal distribution of capital. Because take this example of, a company like Walmart where they could pay more to their workers, and they're starting to. I have to say they've made a number of really good moves in that direction. Unfortunately, the markets have seemed to have accepted that. But, we know that one of the problems in the economy with, slow growth is lack of what they call aggregate demand. People don't have enough money to spend, and we basically said, oh, well, you can borrow the money, and we ran out of steam on that. So we've basically allocated way too much to this thing that is supposed to be, in some sense, the support structure of the economy, and it has become the economy.
What you're touching on is that we've driven it to the limits by using debt in order to cover the shortfall. And in my estimation, what we've been doing is we've been creating a much more feudal type of economy.
Yeah.
And what's concerning is understanding that in the context of the technologies and the tools that we're creating, the fact that we have this increasing divergence of power in society and the accumulation of that power at a certain layer, and these magical technologies that are coming online, that to me is the concern. That is what pushes towards the dystopian scenario that concerns me. Is that a framework that makes sense when I'm describing to you?
Yeah, well, to me, the really interesting issue is, first of all, and Yuval Noah Harari does a great job of explaining this in *Sapiens*. There's this, the way you get people to get beyond Dunbar's number, beyond the small group size, is by persuading people to share an idea. And religion, the state, money, are all these fictions. And I love Wallace Stevens, the poet, anticipated Harari by years, by talking about the notion of the supreme fiction that we're trying, that basically, there's this aesthetic competition for visions of the world that, are the shaping of our reality. But you think about, how we allocate the fruits of what we do as human beings and as a society. And for me, the question is, how do we get it to be optimal? And I'm really fascinated right now with this question of what I'm calling distributional economics. And it's summed up really beautifully in the title of a book by a guy named Alvin Roth. He got the Nobel Prize for the redesign of kidney transplant exchanges. And the book's title is Who Gets What and Why? And his note, he basically did work on marketplaces where you don't exchange money, where price is not the determinant. You're not allowed to buy and sell kidneys. But there are market design problems. If I need let's say my loved one needs a kidney, but I'm incompatible with my loved one, so I can't give them my kidney, but I'll give you, your loved one, my kidney, you give me, there's a lot of risk in that exchange unless it's simultaneous. And he figured out a way to make non-simultaneous exchanges safe. And as a result, a lot more kidney transplants happen. And
that's very interesting. So what you're saying is that he was able to actually make it possible that if, let's say, my wife needed a kidney and I couldn't give it to her, that at the same time I could give my kidney to some other person?
That's right. Yeah, well, that was always how it happened, but it had to be simultaneous because there was always the risk that you'd give up your kidney and then you wouldn't get one.
So like dealing with contracts and money.
Yeah. Right. So the thing that's really interesting is I started thinking about that, and I started realizing that almost all of the great advances on the internet, this is one of my latest things that I'm just trying to think through, are really distributional economics like that. Like the Google ad auction was a way of understanding that price signaling was actually not the best way to organize that market, that there was additional signal. When you think about we now in this era of big data, Amazon has 1 billion products. How do you find 1 billion products? It's not just price signaling. There's all these other data signals that Amazon is using to help facilitate that exchange. Or you think about how do you expand the marketplace for transportation, which is what Uber and Lyft are doing. And yes, price is a big part of it, but we're really building these algorithmic systems that in some sense are changing the fundamental nature of our markets. And in those markets, you understand, first of all, there's this wonderful phrase that I picked up from Mariana Mazzucato, the economist, who said, markets are outcomes. We tend to think they're like natural phenomena naively, but they are design things. And we actually can design them better. And there's all these stories of better designed marketplaces that do a better job of allocating what we have created together. And I'm really interested in this who gets what and why framework of understanding, for example, particularly with AI and big data, can we come up with better allocations than we have today?
So actually, this is brilliant that you're bringing this up, because this is actually the most important part of our conversation thus far, I think. Is there, just for our audience, is there a good source for them to go to if they want to learn more about this particular potential solutions to this problem? Because although we touch on it on the show, I've never heard anyone come in and say that they're specifically thinking about it from this perspective, and they're looking to sort of, because this is really the issue of distribution, and this is like a central problem.
Yeah. I think there are some people starting to write and think about it. I'm not sure I could point to, certainly not in the framework that I've outlined right now, but I will be putting together resources on this. And I'm also just doing a fair amount of research understanding how this is playing out in various of the platform economies, of the big companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon and Alibaba, but also trying to think about it more generally and theoretically. And again, I certainly recommend Alvin Roth's book, Who Gets What and Why. But I also think that, again, I'm not really versed in economics. I've been learning it as I go.
It's a benefit.
And my guess is that there's a lot of really good, thinking on this issue.
We did an episode on moral economics, sort of into the philosophies of Aristotle, and then how that transformed with Adam Smith and further on, and what incentives do to pervert outcomes and what laws signal as information, and combining that really with Hayek's insight on information distribution and price theory. So I agree with you, and I think that it's exciting to hear that there are people that are thinking about this in this particular way. I'm not familiar with it, and I need to actually spend some more time doing that. There is one other thing that you talk about in your book that I want to cover before we conclude our show today, and that has to do with a theory that you've repurposed from biology, symbiogenesis. I don't know if you're the first person to sort of, think about this, but it's really this idea that it's a way of thinking about our place in a world of technology that we're creating that's similar to how evolution has occurred in prokaryotes to eukaryotic cells. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about that framework?
So there's this idea from biology, which apparently was originally articulated by a Russian biologist around the turn of the 20th century, 1908 or something like that. And then it was picked up by Lynn Margulis in the 1950s, I believe, maybe it was the 60s. And she was sort of originally derided for this theory. But it turned out later when they were able to do the genetics, they found out it was true. And the idea was that multicellular organisms were actually colony organisms originally, that the things like our mitochondria or chloroplasts in plants are actually bacteria living inside of other organisms. And it turns out that once you do the genetics, you discover that the cell nucleus and the chloroplast, or the cell nucleus and the mitochondria, actually have different DNA. So she was right. And then, of course, is the theory of the microbiome. Of course, as we understand that as organisms, we are actually colony organisms. This is beyond the intracellular stuff, but extracellular, we have all these microorganisms in our gut, on our skin, and they're actually part of who we are, and they change how our body works, and they change even how our minds work. So those two concepts really seem to me to be a really good analogy for the relationship today between humans and machines. Because, we are building these collective intelligences. And I think the mistake we make when we think about AI is that we think of it as a singular organism, with a consciousness like our own, rather than a collective consciousness. I think, in some sense, a corporation is already an AI. It's a symbiosis between a bunch of humans and a bunch of structures. And then you think about once you digitize that, Google, is basically or Facebook collecting input from, billions of minds and summing it, aggregating it. And, we are the AI. We are now, and we are augmented by these devices. And we're really in the early stages of this. I was just at a company yesterday, that's doing some amazing work on brain-machine interfaces, and we're going to get to the point where it's not just these collective intelligences, but literally we will be symbiotes with our machines. And so I think that there's a path. And sure, there may be purely digital artificial intelligences, but so far, almost all of them are in some sense, the closest we've come is, AlphaGo Zero, which basically wasn't trained on human games, but just trained by itself. But that's still a very narrow artificial intelligence. But most of them are trained on human data, which again is this symbiotic, pathway to making our machines smarter.
You're talking about BCI, and in general, these are more immersive technologies. Does it concern you where these experiences are happening? For example, the fact that they're happening on servers that are owned by private corporations. Does that concern you? And is that something that, because I think about also distributed consensus and these distributed ledger technologies and protocols as being a possible bridge to facilitate, to maintain our freedom in this world. That is a personal concern I have. I wonder how you view that.
I guess I'm a little skeptical of that because ultimately, there's this, myth of our independence. And I would just say,
You mean the individual as an egoic construct?
Yeah, the individual. We are not independent of our society. Mm-hmm. If our entire system in which we must trust, if it breaks down, 95% of humanity is dead.
Right.
You think about New York City. There's this huge machine that is bringing us food here in New York City. It stops. What do we do?
Physically, yes.
Physically, the power stops. So this idea that somehow we need this sovereignty, I think, no, we need to build systems that we can trust. We need to build systems that really work for us and rather than against us. And we need to build norms that we can rely on.
What about the integrity of our minds? So that touches again on search algorithms on Facebook particularly, which...
Yeah, I guess I would say that even there, yes, I would just say first off, Facebook is a mirror, not a master. There's a great experiment I suggest to people, and I noticed it one day because I was, this is in the height of the election. I was clicking on a lot of news stories on Facebook about the election, and it was showing me lots and lots of news stories about the election, and I was particularly getting lots of hyper-partisan stuff. And I looked over at Jen, my wife's, Facebook feed, and she was seeing lots of updates from friends. And it was like, oh, she's clicking on updates from friends. So I started saying, no matter how interesting it looks, I'm not going to click on that. I'm just going to look, I'm going to seek out for a while, and just, an hour or two, I'm going to retrain Facebook to show me, my friends' vacations, my friends', kids' pictures. And sure enough, before long, I didn't have any news in my feed. I just had, we are telling it what to give us.
That is true. I agree with that. So a few things. It also, though, doesn't it reward some of the most basic instincts, which are sort of immediate gratification? Mm-hmm. There's that. And then also there are companies that advertise on the platform. And so all the data that's used to understand and map out the behavioral tendencies of the users are used to...
Yeah, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be concerned about these things and that we shouldn't, push back. But what I'm fundamentally saying is that in our society, we live in a world of enormous power imbalances. Mm-hmm. And I am not sure that the answer is, to me, this kind of an intellectual equivalent to being a survivalist and going and living in Idaho or whatever. It's like we have to own the means. No, I'm sorry, that's not the way the world works today.
Have you seen that Vice episode of the guy that lives 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle?
No, I haven't.
You should see it. But go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
But it's like no, we have to build a system that we are part of that we can trust.
Well, I agree with that.
And that to me is the challenge. And so whenever I see people saying, no, we have to build this alternate system where somehow we have this atomic unit of control, I would say, it's actually a diversion from the real challenge, which is to hold the systems that are big, that we are part of, that sustain us, to hold them accountable to work for us as a whole. And that's, of course, what was the original American experiment. It was this idea that we aren't going to have a king. We are going to govern ourselves.
So the alternate side of that, before we wrap it up, is there's again, I was expressing some concern around where the power resides in being able to use these tools.
Yeah.
The other one that brings it back to this symbiogenesis idea is a problem that we have, or that is commonly sort of thought about in intellectual circles dealing with general AI, which is how do you create an artificial intelligence that surpasses human intelligence without losing control? It's like the AI control problem. Is there some interesting, this is what I wanted to ask, is there some interesting thought experiment in thinking about developing AI and then thinking of the utility function, seeing human beings as the parasite, the beneficent parasite, and sort of thinking of it that way? I mean, that was something that I would often think about when I was reading Nick Bostrom's book a few years ago, or a year ago when it was, a couple of years ago. And it came to my mind when I was reading your book and this particular passage. I don't know if that's something you've ever thought about, or... Yeah,
I mean, first of all, I do believe that superintelligence of that kind is a long way off.
Right.
I'm a big fan of Andrew Ng's comment where he said, it's a little bit like worrying about overpopulation on Mars. It could eventually be a problem, but we're nowhere near it. And, most of the practitioners, the actual practitioners in the field, are of that opinion that it's, 20, 30, 50, 100 years before we even need to be worrying about it. But this also it's just a kind of, again, a worry I have sometimes that we're diverting ourselves from the real issues. And Joanna Bryson is fabulous on this. She calls this sort of fake fear of AI. There's a real fear of AI today. And Zeynep Tufekci is great on this too. People are being killed today because of face recognition of protesters in crowds in repressive regimes.
Sure.
That's the fear of AI we should be worried about. Not that we're going to have some super intelligence that's going to come...
Civilization ending AI.
Yeah, and I guess I kind of think about it, I mean, I guess in the long scheme of things, it is certainly a possible risk, but I also think it's a risk, it's also, there's an incredible set of opportunities there. In some sense, I would compare it to, we are on, for example, Western civilization, we are on the winning side of this evolution, not evolutionary, but this winning side of this competition with hunter-gatherer societies. When we go into some remote area of the Amazon, they are experiencing that AI moment today.
I mean, that's a complete unicorn moment.
Right. And we are, how do we know that we wouldn't say, from the perspective of the future, that, we like being on the side of this AI civilization? When I say we, might even be, the AIs that are living in that, and they're intelligent. Again, assuming, it's just as a thought experiment, I just sort of sit there and I say, imagine, would the, if the Yanomamo could have pulled the plug somehow on all of modern civilization, would we say, oh yeah, that was a good thing?
Well, I mean, if you see that Vice special of this guy, willingly, and he's not a kooky guy. He actually raised a family, and he's affable and everything. But I wouldn't, and I think the vast majority of people wouldn't want to go live in that manner. We just simply have too many comforts. And you've actually write very eloquently, I think, about this the optimistic scenarios of the future and sort of all the beautiful use cases. One particular picture of an augmented physician, someone that has the capacity as an individual to make a house call, whether it's actually at your house or some tribe in some underdeveloped country or continent. And I think that is extremely promising. And I think we're in a situation where, regardless, this is where we're going, and technology offers us the best opportunities we can to actually make it through, considering so many of the other existential challenges we face. But Tim, I don't want to take up any more of your time, and you've been very gracious in giving it to me and to our audience. I thank you for coming on the program.
I'm so glad to be here. I really enjoyed this.
Thanks, Tim.
And that was my episode with Tim O'Reilly. I want to thank Tim for being on my program. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforcespod.com. Join the conversation through Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforcespod.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.